Hi.
Hi.
I almost said howdy because that's usually what I say, but I'm a combination of exhausted and exasperated. So hi is about all I had.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're getting all ready to move and you've got all that stuff going on. So,
There's lots of stuff going on. And yes, for those of you here on Patreon, we have not directly mentioned that yet.
whoops.
Natalie's doing like a oopsie. Um, there are some changes in the works, and we're still waiting on final. The final word should, in theory, be tomorrow, whether or not we know for a fact what is happening. Um, which by the time you hear this, I will already know. But for now, there's a little teaser for you. Things are changing. Um,
Well, hopefully I didn't jinx anything.
right. Put it out to the world and then something changes.
I know.
Because that
Well, it
never
doesn't change
happens.
anything for listeners anyway, right?
No. It
Okay.
other than like some perspective and content type stuff, but otherwise, no, it does not directly affect the podcast or the future fourth season of the podcast or anything like that, as far as like, making anything
Content.
stop or
Mhm.
change or have
Yeah.
consequences. So we're good there. Um, so today we are going to be following up sort of off of one of the topics that you and Les touched on the last natural beekeeping episode that
Mhm.
aired on Monday, November 1st. And in that one, that was the natural beekeeping corner part 8. And you guys talked about mainly the intensity thresholds of how many hives can fit on any certain piece of land based on the available forage there, and what
Yes.
happens when you go through that. But you guys also touched on the importance of your queen and the queen's genetics, and you
Mhm.
touched on some aspects related to honey. There was a
Yes.
little blip in there
Mhm.
about please don't be this person, and I thought that this would be a good forum to segue just that section over and go through and actually have a conversation about that. So
Mhm.
before we get started, I will give a story that I may have told on the main podcast way back in season 1, and I'm old enough now that I can't remember if that actually happened. So this may be a repeat story or this may be a new story. I don't know. But when I first moved to Austin and decided that I was going to be going into beekeeping from a hobby perspective over into like a commercial, well, not commercial, but a business perspective, where it wasn't just going to be, I'm going to have a hive in my backyard and that's going to be, a hobby. It's now going to be business income and everything else. And I was looking at all of the requirements that were for the state of Texas specifically to sell your honey,
Mhm.
everything that went involved with that and everything else. And I spoke to another beekeeping individual here in the same town and was kind of, just discussing like a sounding board, discussing some of the ideas and things that I was planning on doing. And I was told very, very early on, right up front, that I needed to start planning on buying honey wholesale and then repackaging it as my own and reselling it. Because if I sell my honey in a store, say I find a nice little niche market somewhere and I sell my honey there, and they find out that it is an amazing product and that it's a good selling product, and then all of a sudden I run out, well, then they're just going to go through and they're going to replace me with somebody else, and therefore you lose your footing and your
Customer.
traction on
Yeah.
that customer base. So my dog's getting a drink. Sorry.
Oh, I didn't
There
hear.
was this all of a sudden this like loud slurping over on the side, and I was like, "What is that?"
John, what are you doing?
Lay down, crawl underneath the desk. Okay, sorry. Anyhow, um, so at that point, I was like, "Well, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that because I
No, I
want."
know I don't. I
Right,
don't agree at
exactly.
all.
I know you don't agree at all. And that's how I was initially, is I was like, well, but I don't know that I agree with that. And that's fine if that's the path that you chose to go down. But
Mhm.
me, myself, the vision that I have for mine is, educating everybody on where the honey comes from, what the honey is, and how the process works. And part of the selling point is that my honey is unique, my
Mhm.
honey is finite,
And it's
and it is
authentic.
seasonal, Yes, it's authentic. It's artisan or artesian, however you want to say that. But the whole point of it is that it is seasonal, it is finite, and it fluctuates with the years. It fluctuates with the seasons. And some years, as we've discussed on the podcast before, we have bountiful flows of nectar and
Hmm.
honey, and other years it just tanks. And so this year, oh, by the way, I was on the news yesterday or day
Oh,
before
you
yesterday.
were?
I was
What
on the news day
happened?
before yesterday, in regards to this actual topic, in regards to
Ah,
honey
okay.
specifically. But the fact of how the winter storm is still having lasting impacts on farmers and beekeepers and things. And one of the things that I brought up in that interview was the fact that we only produced, myself, my business only produced 1/6 of the amount of honey that we would normally produce on average due to the winter storm. So that also means that this year, that honey is even more rare and more desirable because there's a
Hmm.
very, very limited amount of it out there. So you educate your consumers, you educate the clients and the people that come around and are interested so that they understand and they know this honey is from me and you know exactly where it comes from. You can come visit the bees and but then it's gone when it's gone.
Right.
And next year it will be back and you can come and you can buy more. And I try to even parcel my stuff out because like the comb honey, I can sell out a comb honey in a day. So
Right.
I have to set limits on you cannot buy more than 5 jars because I've got to allow it to spread. I've got other
Hmm.
vendors that want it. I've got other people that are on waiting lists every year for it.
Exactly.
And they're on that waiting list because they love it, they want it, and they're willing
Mhm.
to wait for it. So, was it beneficial to me to go down the avenue that I was told I needed to go down? No, it was not. It was better for me to have my own sense of ID, my own sense of identity, and have my own morals and values and standards when it came to my bees and my honey and my production
It's called
versus
ethics.
ethics. There you go. Honey ethics, ethics and honey.
Hmm.
And it was better for me to do that than it was to have the dollar signs of, but I've got a continuous flow of
Hmm.
honey and money coming back in from the honey if I buy and resell from other individuals. So that's kind of the lead into this. And you guys touched on that. And you had this little brief moment where you and Les were both like, please don't be that individual who goes and buys honey from other beekeepers,
Hmm.
repackages it as your own, and then continues to sell it. And Les did have a caveat that was basically the
Disclose
only
it.
time he's done that is when he had a
Hmm.
really good friend that he knows and trusts that produced
Hmm.
honey in another country. And he actually bought that honey, imported it in, went through all the regulations he's supposed to. But when he sold that honey, he sold that honey as this is so and so's honey that is my friend and I am reselling it for him.
Correct. He disclosed
So
every single, fact about it.
yeah, he did not go through and change it up or do anything that was off topic with it to make it seem like it was
Hmm.
his. He wasn't doing anything deceptive. That's really what I want to say with that.
Right. Yeah. Don't get me started.
No,
I
no,
have a lot to
that's
say
the whole
about all
point.
this stuff.
I want you to get started. That is the whole point. That's what we're
Well,
talking about today.
it kind of all started in the 20s, 20, I think it was 11, or I forget which year exactly it was. There was a big scandal about the honey laundering.
Right.
And things started coming out about importers that were buying bulk from different countries, some of which were just relays for even other countries, and they were mixing in a lot of like syrups and other things to dilute that honey. And in the end, it was more of a sweet syrup mixed in with maybe a little bit of honey, to pass as the real stuff, and that was getting repackaged and sold in grocery stores, driving the prices down. And it still happens, by the way. Um, and it was making it impossible for beekeepers to compete, because volume and low prices made it impossible for them to compete on that. So that was a big scandal, and a lot of this is still happening, and is still beekeepers that are I mean, the feds got involved at that time, and that kind of calmed things down, but there's still countries that are importing. And the big culprit is China is doing a whole lot of the counterfeiting of, they're selling rice syrup and all
Yeah.
kinds of things that
Rice
it
syrup,
promote,
high
mhm, that
fructose
it
corn syrup.
That it
And
promote us being able to pass all those tests and
yep,
not be recognized as fraudulent.
right. And that's
So
actually how it is. That's the whole point, is they're literally marketing it to their buyers that way. We
mhm.
can get you this cheaper product that tastes the same, it's just as sweet, and it will pass the standardization tests so that you can pass it off as real honey,
Yeah.
and it's not.
So that's the industrial version of what we just talked about. But if we stay at the local level, that still happens where you've got, what happens is that in the honey industry, you have packers, big honey packers that will buy bulk and just sell in smaller bulk. And then you have the local beekeepers that have stores that tend to want to sell that honey because there's an endless supply of customers that are always going to want to buy their honey. And they're going to say, well, it's local. It's not necessarily local. It's been bought from bulk suppliers and packers. And then they, like you mentioned, they will rebottle it and put their labels on them.
Yeah. So
And I find
one little side note there to that, and Ken and I talked about this in the first or second, I think it was the first season of the podcast. We talked about the honey packers and distributors themselves. There is one, well, technically there are two in the Austin area that are major quote unquote packers or producers of honey. They call themselves honey producers, and
yes,
they are able to sell their honey with an actual local sticker, big yellow
yes,
local sticker that
yes,
says that it's local. But really the only thing with that honey that is local is that it was actually packaged and bottled in
package.
Austin.
That
But that
honey
honey doesn't
never,
come anywhere
no,
near Austin.
not from Texas bees.
Right.
That's for
And
sure.
so you've got that bigger commercial aspect of it. But then you've also got, accidental and intentional adulteration of honey, even at the individual beekeeper level for people that have smaller operations, where you can accidentally overfeed the sugar syrup and they can pack it in there and cap it. And then later, when you go to extract it, you don't necessarily know what was capped sugar syrup versus what is capped nectar and honey. And it may get mixed in there, but there
funny honey.
Yes, there are other beekeepers though that will intentionally feed the sugar syrup in mass quantities during the nectar flow, because the nectar, depending on the different season, especially, the taste of honey is so strong, it can overpower things that don't have a flavor, like corn syrup or sugar syrup, those different types of things that they use to adulterate it. So even table sugar mixed in to feed the bees can very easily be overpowered with the flavor of the other nectars and honeys. And then therefore you taste it and you're like, ooh, this is honey. But in reality, it may be, 50% or more sugar syrup that was fed to the bees. So that can be done on accident. That can also be done on purpose. And that's a larger thing outside of the different ways that you can be deceptive or unethical in your honey production.
That's exactly right. And to the extreme, and I hate to come back to specific countries, but in China, and I was there, I have bought honey both in comb and as liquid and brought it back to the US. And I ended up never, ever touching it because it's actually hyper saturated with illegal antibiotics and things that are not legal in the United States that could be potentially dangerous. Or not potentially, that are dangerous, and can create antibiotic resistance. The liquid honey that I had brought back ended up separating completely in 2 layers. You could see there was 2 different kinds of liquids in there, and overflowing in a way that told me that there was too much actual liquid in there.
Too much moisture.
So if you don't know that, but it happens that they will take all the honey and force feed the bees endlessly with that sugar syrup all the time and keep harvesting, keep feeding the sugar syrup. And that's not really real honey, like you were saying. But that is also true. Usually I tell my customers, if it comes in comb, you can't tell, it hasn't been adulterated, but this is one way to get around it. So you really have to know your beekeeper, because even in the comb, it could be still sugar syrup in there.
It very well could. And that's a great point. So this is a double-edged sword. So anybody listening to this who is an ethical individual can sit there and go, oh my God, I never thought of that. And, I need to be aware and I need to educate. But also anybody, unfortunately, listening to this who is unethical can go, oh my God, I never thought of that. I'm going to have to try it.
Yes. Well, hopefully that's not the kind of people that are listening to this.
Right. That is also a big hope for certain. But so you've got all these different ways that it can actually be misleading or
Mhm.
misrepresenting
Or
how.
completely unethical or even illegal.
Right. Well, and the adulteration aspect of it is actually very much
Mhm.
illegal. That is it's number, technically it goes back and forth between number one and number two most adulterated products right now on the
Yes.
market for food
Mhm.
is virgin olive oil or extra virgin
And
olive
honey.
oil and honey. And they take turns going for first position on that whole thing. So it is a big deal, and it's one of
Yes.
the things that the importing of that type of honey that comes in from the other countries that affects all the beekeepers here in
Mhm.
the United States. It's the same thing for like our listeners down in Australia. If you are in a country and you're producing your own honey, but your country is consuming way more honey
That they're
than you
producing.
produce and they're getting it from other countries, if those other countries are adulterating it, selling it at a cheaper price, the local beekeeper cannot compete with
Mhm.
that price unless you
That's right.
educate the end consumer on the value of your honey, the true quality of the honey, and then why
Mhm.
the price is what it is for that honey, because it's
Yes.
actually honey. And
Right.
I've said many times before that if we actually charged
Oh
what
my
honey
gosh.
would be, if we put all of
So,
the costs and
yeah.
expenses into it, you would never be able to afford it.
Well, I mean, and to a certain extent, Les and I, our business is not honey. So when we do
Right.
sell honey, we're going to sell it boutique, and we're going to make the price. We're going to price it accordingly because it is a whole lot of work, and we don't have that much. So, like you mentioned earlier, we have a finite quantity of a high-end product, so we are able to kind of market it accordingly. And it's not even what we're counting on for our income making. We are more of a services company, because I think that every time you focus your business model around honey production, you're tempted by those unethical practices. If you end up selling in grocery stores and or large chain food stores, chances are you're not going to produce enough to satisfy the demand anyway. So as far as I'm concerned, when I go in a grocery store or I go to Whole Foods or whatever, I'm looking at what's on the shelves, and I can kind of tell what's legit and what's not. And more often than not, that honey is not either not honey at all, or it's been cut and mixed with other honeys without you knowing it.
Right. The grocery store thing. So when you do live in a town and you know everybody in that town, because even Austin's
Exactly.
a big city, but it's still a
That's
small
right.
town, a small world when
Mhm.
it comes to this, right?
We all know each other.
So I go into Walmart. This is also something that I've said on the
Well,
main
I mean,
podcast
and
before.
if you're going to Walmart, of
Oh, no,
course.
no, 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 no. Check it out though. I go into
Okay.
Walmart and I specifically go back and I look at the honey section because I was going to be doing a presentation on honey and I
Ah,
wanted images of cheap store honey on the shelves and to show
right,
you all the varieties, and they all come from everywhere but here, right?
right.
But there was one packer producer on the shelf and they had two jars, bottles, plastic bottles side by side, identical bottles, identical shaped labels, identical font on the labels, but this label was a different color and had a different name. And the other
Mm-hmm.
label was a different color and had a different name, but everything
Mm-hmm.
else about them was identical.
Yeah.
And when you flipped them over and you read the back, they were both made by the same company. But here was the kicker: the one that had the company's name, which is what everybody knows here in town,
Yes.
was $9, and the same thing that they sell across the country on an off-brand name was $5, and it was the
Yes.
same freaking product.
And for a long time, that was the same in the regular grocery stores as well, because I have seen and I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah. And that one kicked me though, because I was just like, really, like side by side, you're selling. Now you can literally see, and it was perfect
Yeah.
for the example to bring into the clubs and show them this is what can happen.
Yes.
And when you do that here, they're like, I know that company or I know those people. And I'm like, right. And the bottle right beside it that is $4 cheaper is the same
Mhm.
company and the same honey. So they're charging you more because you know their brand name here.
And you think they're local, and that's
Right.
local honey, and
And
it's
so
not.
they're able to charge you more. But in reality, it's not at all. It's being imported from other countries, other
Yeah.
states, and
Mexico,
that's
India.
yeah, and that's one of the things that like I have a distributor that I will work with sometimes that the majority of their stuff comes from the United States,
Mhm.
but it's still not coming from Texas. And
Yeah.
there's certain types of honey that you can go through and figure that out. There's also varietals are a good way to kind of give
Orange
that away.
blossom
Right.
or
Where does orange blossom grow?
Yeah.
not in Central
Guajillo.
Texas.
Yes.
So when you find a local beekeeper in Central Texas that has 500 or less colonies and they're all in Central Texas and they are not commercial and they do not travel, they should not be able to sell you varietal honey that is alfalfa, clover,
I
orange
know.
blossom, guajillo, because none of those things are here. The closest you can get for us in our area is mesquite, and that's it. And
And
even
I have
then, you're walking that fine line of does it have 40 to 60% of just that one source
that's
or
true.
not? Because
So I
even
have,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I apologize. I have seen and I have been there when those people actually were talking to their suppliers and paying their invoices, buying that honey. And I know they had their logo on there later down the street, later on the time, right? So I'm like, what are we doing here? Who are we fooling? And how ethical is this?
Right. It turns into basically just the dollar sign.
You end up with back alley type of deals where people are in the dark of the night are going to conferences in, you know, big schools and are talking to those commercial beekeepers that are, you know, either packers or you know, wholesale providers, and they're buying those 5-gallon buckets at a time and they're shoving them in the back of their vehicles. I have been there, I've seen it. And then taking it home to kind of either dilute their own honey or pack as their own and sell. They don't, I'm not even sure if they know what's in that honey, where it came from. And what's important to know and why it's important is because a lot of the bulk honey that's in this country is indeed imported. We don't produce enough honey in this country for the demand. Period.
No, we
I don't know
produce,
of any country that does.
No, we don't produce
except maybe
enough.
For China, and that's the issue.
But how much do they really produce versus manufacture?
Well, how much of that is that really honey, right? Is the question. So what happens is that this is the kind of scheme. I was reading an article just today actually about India is having such a big problem. Their beekeepers are not making any money anymore. They cannot afford to stay in business because it's more expensive for them to stay in business than what they can afford to sell, what they can sell, because they can compete with and apparently those are imports from China that are getting imported on sugar syrups, and it's called golden syrups. It's called high fructose, tapioca fructose syrup, honey blend, fructose rice syrup for honey, all kinds of things. And that's when it's actually disclosed. But now they have even just kind of syrups that are rice based that are not even disclosed as such, and they can pass all those tests and they get imported into India, and then they get exported to the US. But even in India now, they've got facilities that have learned from the Chinese companies how to make those locally. So they don't even have to import them anymore, meaning there's less and less traces of what's going on as far as shenanigans are concerned. So it's a really shady business. And what is really irritating me is that, especially in the era of COVID, where people are buying honey for its antimicrobial, antiviral, and health properties, and they think they're getting that, and they're feeding on that honey to make them stronger. It's actually making them weaker, less healthy, and fatter, and more prone, more susceptible to COVID problems. So it's a criminal, is all there is to it.
Yeah, what you're doing is almost the same concept as like a turkey. There was a study a while back where I want to say it was marjoram was originally created as a potential food source to fatten turkeys so that they could have bigger birds for Thanksgiving. And if you turn around and you look at the concept of like our honey, if you have pure, real, raw, local honey, it can have, especially depending on how you extract it. Like I do crush and strain because I have a lot of top bars. You're going to get more pollen in that just from the act of crushing and straining it. When you do the extractor, you're not necessarily as much because the pollen will actually stay in the comb and the liquid will fly out of the comb, but you're going to have trace amounts of the pollen in there. And then you've got all of the enzymes and all of the amino acids that are in honey and in pollen together is literally the full complement that any living creature needs to survive.
Yes.
All of those things are in there. They make them healthy, they make them beneficial. And the actual way that the sugar structure is formed, even though it is still your simple glucose, fructose, dextrose, the way that it is formed in those structures in there, it's almost like a chelated type effect that your body can absorb more naturally, and it doesn't have some of the weird or bad effects that the other stuff
That's right.
can. You replace that with corn syrup, and you're sitting there guzzling jugs of corn syrup. None of that is healthy for you. It's spiking the sugar because it's not the same structure of sugar. And yeah, and there's none of the other beneficial aspects to it whatsoever.
That's right. So those enzymes, those amino acids, those flavonoids or phenolic compounds, all this stuff, the minerals, the oligo elements, the oligosaccharides, all the phytochemicals, all this stuff that's in honey is what makes it good for your immune system and your health. That makes it antimicrobial, antiviral, and all that stuff. But the rice syrups, any of those syrups, is actually inflammatory. It actually decreases the strength of your immune system.
Yeah, it causes other issues that your body then has to focus on, and it can't then focus on what it needs to be doing, which is fighting off the viruses and bacteria and stuff that gets in your body that should not be there.
Yep. So now they're using resin-based filters, ultra filtering, to try to kind of clean off that honey from toxic compounds like those antibiotics I was talking about, those pesticides, even clear off the pollen so that they, it's untraceable which country they come from.
Right.
And that's really, you have to get it through those filters, you have to heat that honey, which destroys the enzymes. If it was honey in the first place, which is not.
You've now rendered it inert, so it no longer has any active living properties to it. Yeah.
So if it's not scary.
Yeah, you filter it, you pass it, you heat it, kills all the stuff, pass it through a extremely high micron I cannot think anymore. Micron filter that actually strips everything out of it but the liquid. So any type of solid anything out of there is gone. So now all your pollen's gone. It can't be traced. It doesn't have any of the beneficial properties of that anymore. Right. And what you're left with is sugar. And not only that, but when you heat honey, when you heat fructose,
I was going to get to that. Yes.
It creates hydroxymethylfurfural, which is toxic to insects and bees. And it's not actually good for people. That caramelized smell when you make candy is the process of actually making HMF. And it can actually be degradatory to the human body, just like it can insects.
So the moral of this story is I would be highly skeptical of what you find on large volumes and on grocery shelves of any kinds. And also I would tend to recommend, if you are really serious about the beneficial properties of honey, I would talk to your local beekeepers. Now, once this whole honey cheating business is aside, there's also one last thing I want to mention, is that about 97% of beekeepers put pesticides into their colonies to treat pests and decrease those pest levels. And that can actually be leaching into the honey, and at the very least the wax that's lipophilic. And but they don't tell you that. So it can still be a local beekeeper, and you can still buy product that hasn't been heated, that's not necessarily ultra filtered or anything, but that still contains more pesticides than you really want to see in your honey.
Yeah.
So
there's a reason why on all of the types of treatments, literally all of them with the exception of one, say that you must remove all honey supers before using this treatment. And that doesn't mean that just when the nectar flow is going, it can already be capped honey. You have to remove it. It could be empty comb. You still have to remove it, because exactly what you said, the wax absorbs anything that is an oil type base, and all of those chemicals it absorbs into the wax, and then eventually the wax can get super saturated and leach it back out into the brood or into the nectar or the honey.
That's right.
And then there it is. And now you've got, because honey itself is hygroscopic. So that means it is devoid of moisture to the point that it is so desperate for it
that will suck it in.
That's right. If a bacteria molecule hits it, it eviscerates it because it shreds it to suck the moisture out of it. So it's also then pulling, and you've got this wax that is then super saturated that is releasing, and the honey pulls in those toxins. And then you've got it that way too. So it's It is really like a minefield, honestly. I was going to say a double-edged sword. It's just a minefield. Like,
Yeah.
be careful where you step when it comes to honey.
Look, I mean, I think that realistically speaking, there's only a very small amount of beekeepers that are producing good quality, honest to goodness type of honey that's not contaminated by things and that hasn't been heated or that's been kept properly. The other thing that a lot of beekeepers might not know is to preserve the freshness of your honey. If you're not going to consume it right away, you can put it in the freezer.
Yeah.
And the freezer is going to stop any kind of alteration that happens over time, especially with heat, where you still have a small amount of those HMFs, those hydromethyl that you are talking about, that's still going to build up over time. Well, and crystallization will happen over time as well. If you freeze that honey right away, then it will preserve those enzymes. It will preserve all that goodness and those vitamins and anything that's in there. And your honey will last longer. It will not freeze per se because there's not enough water in it. It will turn to a glassy state,
Yep.
But it will really keep it a lot longer fresh and quality products. So,
Yeah, don't ever put it in the refrigerator because
No.
that'll make it crystallize almost instantly. But the freezer does almost put it into like suspended animation. And if you have it in a jar with like an air bubble at the top, even after it's been frozen for a week, you can take it and flip it over and that air bubble will slowly move back up to the top because it's still a liquid form. It's not a frozen solid.
It's a glassy state. Yeah, it still runs ever so slowly.
Yep. And that's how we actually store. I've got a deep freeze dedicated just to comb honey and 5-gallon buckets.
So this is why I think we don't have that much. So this is not our business model. So I'm not trying to sell my honey. But what I'm going to say is this is why when I talk to people, I will tell them that our honey is completely raw, because there's raw and completely raw, by the way. Some people can still call their honey raw if they heat it up enough for it to be liquid enough to go to bottling and filtering and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But if it's completely raw, it's never been heated. And then the other aspect of things is that I tell people our honey, when we have any, comes from organically managed colonies. So I've gotten a little flack for that, but it's the truth. We haven't put any kind of foreign compounds in there. We are managing them organically. We're not putting any foreign substance in there. So
the trick with that phrasing is organically managed. You're not saying it's organic honey. You're saying that your management practices are organic.
So tell us why you cannot say this is organic honey.
Well, that is because you cannot control where the bees go. So even the apiary that is out, my main apiary that you guys hear me talk about all the time, Les and Natalie are actually going to be taking over that location.
Yes.
And it is on a when I first started, it was an active organic farm. Mm-hmm. And to be certified as an organic farm, your farm area and then every open piece of land around you for X amount of distance has to have organic properties, no treatments, no pesticides, no herbicides, no fungicides. All of that stuff comes into play. Well, the kicker is your bees fly further than the restrictions that are placed for an organic certification. So you can't control where they're going anyway. And to find an area where you can guarantee they're not flying further than that restrictive zone and foraging on something that was then treated, or that somebody's house treats their little garden there and they're foraging on that and bringing it back. Like you can't guarantee that. So you cannot actually say that your honey is organic. Honey. You can't, you don't know where it comes from.
With one exception, is what you see in some grocery store. At some bottles will say organic honey. If you flip that around and you look at the label, it's always imported, because the only countries that allow organic certification for honey are not in America. I mean, it's not America. It's not the United States. It's usually in Europe.
Yeah, and those are also countries that have been way more restrictive on what can be done, and they have a lot more. They have bans on certain pesticides and chemicals that can and can't be used. And you do run into certain instances sometimes where, say, you're an island nation and none of that stuff's allowed on your island nation. And the bees, therefore, anything they forage on is going to end up being organic, because there is no inorganic pesticides or chemicals or synthetic properties that are being used. So you can run into those. But here in the United States, no, it's not a thing.
It's going to be imported. Yes.
Yep. It's not a thing other than a marketing tactic. That is it on that part.
Now, when you have the chance of knowing a beekeeper that produces that quality honey, that's going to be very finite. So just be aware it's only season specific and season dependent. Very often they will run out of their stores and their reserves before the new crop of harvesting takes place. So I would say appreciate it for what it is. And also when you try it, note that the taste will be completely different from what you have ever had before.
That's right. And it changes every time.
Mhm.
So at the moment, I still have like 3 or 4 buckets left of honey.
Mhm.
2 of those have a very, to me, I've let multiple people taste them, and apparently I'm the only one that gets it. But to me, it almost has a smoky taste,
Mhm.
and that irritates the crap out of me. But everybody else is like, oh, it's almost got like a little hint
Barbecue?
of like a sour kind of note here or there. And I'm like, no. There's an overwhelming thing that I pick up that apparently you're missing, you know.
Right.
But so those 2 buckets taste very similar to each other. The next
Mhm.
bucket, which was the extraction prior to that, has a completely different flavor palette because every colony is foraging, even though they're in the same yard, they're in the same 40-acre patch, they're
Mhm.
going different directions and foraging on different things. And so every one of those hives has a very unique signature for that
Mhm.
season. Next season, that signature will change because
That's
the
right.
floral patterns will change, your bloom patterns will change. And so it's constantly evolving, but it absolutely is not anything you've ever tasted in the store. The
It's amazing. It's
consistency,
mind
the
blowing.
flavor,
Mhm.
the complexity of the flavor,
The
all of it,
texture you said? Yeah.
the consistency.
Even.
So like
Yeah.
I have some honeys that I will harvest in the spring that are 18% or lower on the moisture content, but they're
Normal.
extremely thin. And it
Mhm.
it doesn't make sense because you're like, this is runny, this means it's a lot of moisture, but then you do the moisture test and you're like, it's not a lot of moisture. So
Honey is amazing.
yeah, and then you've got other honey that is at the same moisture content and it is thick and it barely moves when you try to
Mhm.
pour it, you know. So all of those things can be taken into note. But if you get honey and you taste it and it tastes like the honey that you've always bought from the grocery store, that should be
I
your
would
first
run.
indication
Yeah.
right there. Something's probably wrong because it
Mhm.
should never taste like what you get off the shelf in the grocery store.
And this might be controversial and I might be getting myself in trouble, but I think that if you have any kind of large honey supplier in your area, I would be somewhat doubtful that all of that is theirs.
Well,
I
so
would
here's
be.
here's a good way to figure that out. If you can ascertain how many hives they have
Mhm.
that they themselves truly own, you
Of
should
their
very
own, yes,
easily be able to backwards engineer the math and figure out
that's
how
right.
much honey they should be able to produce on average.
And colonies that they're managing doesn't they don't count
No,
because those are not they're not going to harvest that honey for themselves. They're going to harvest that honey for their owners
right.
potentially, but they only have a certain number of colonies that are actually their own that they put in forage yards, and that's where the production comes from. And that I don't know any beekeepers around us anyway, or in Texas that has enough colonies to supply the quantities that we are seeing in different
Right.
stores.
So for instance, if you have so there's 2 different ones that I will use as examples here. Technically there's 3. I'll use all 3 of them.
Mhm.
The local one for here in Austin that uses
Mhm.
the big yellow label that says local
Mhm.
no longer owns any hives around here, period.
I heard.
There is another one that has the same name in the title as the
Mhm.
city where it is produced. They no longer own any hives except for just a few.
Hmm.
There's a third one just outside of town. Now I'm coming up with more now. So now there's 4.
Mhm.
There's a third one just outside of town that used to have about 200 hives. Now they just have like 5 to 20 that they use for demonstration purposes and trainings and the classes that they teach. No honey production from those.
Mhm.
There's another one that was outside of town that's closer to where Ken lives that at one point in time in their heyday, they did have over 1,000 hives. Now
Oh
they
wow, that's a
have
lot.
now they have less than 100.
Mhm.
But all of those scenarios, you're looking at 100 or fewer colonies, in
Yeah.
some cases, no colonies, and
Mhm.
yet you find them in nationwide chains where you can
And
buy that
volumes that
name
are
of honey
yeah.
outside of the state of Texas. If you even have like 500 hives, you should not be able to supply a chain that is through the state of Texas itself, let alone the whole country.
Yes.
So that's a big indicator right there. If you're like, oh, how many hives do you have? I've got 200 hives. Awesome. How the bleepity bleep are you selling to Walmart in, New Mexico?
You know how they're selling to, that volume.
Oh yeah, because it's not theirs.
That's right. But the problem, John, and that's where I think ethics in beekeeping is lacking, is that they will not tell you, but they also will get hyper defensive and sometimes even borderline criminal. I had heard a story of somebody going to one of those larger, honey
hacker producers and asking questions about their beehives and where are your hives and all this stuff. And they got told to leave the premises, and they were calling the police, and they were getting very belligerent. Downright vicious. Yes. I saw some of that on social media. I think you actually shared some of that over, and that was like,
that was another one. The most recent one that's going on is actually they're getting there's lawsuits going on.
Former employee that got fed up with all the lying and cheating and quit and called him out.
Filling the beans with pictures of invoices to back up their claims and all this. I mean, there was there's all kinds of shenanigans going on.
There is unfortunately, unfortunately that is true. So like to kind of put things in perspective since how you guys obviously, you hear me every week. Poor people. So to put things into perspective, like for myself, when I first started off, I had 2 hives. That was the whole goal. And then by the end of that year, I had 13 hives. And the end of the next year, I had 25 hives. And the end of the next year, I had well over 100 hives, and only 50 of them were manageable hives. Right. The rest were removal hives that I hadn't figured out what to do with yet. And I had to come up with a business strategy and a plan on like, how do you rehabilitate these and move them through and cycle through my stuff. But I found out very quickly that 50 was my threshold, because without hiring an employee, I could go do 1 removal every single day, 7 days a week, go out to the removal yard and drop that hive off, check a few of the hives to make sure that maybe they've got a queen or they don't, or everything looks good, or they didn't abscond, then go to the main apiary and touch 10 more hives before I went home, so that at the end of the week, I have checked all of my hives. That was a lot. And so that was my point where I was like, the sun comes up and I leave, and I'm driving home after dark. I pass out exhausted and get up and do it again.
Because it's hot in Texas too.
Oh God. Yeah. Then that's a whole nother story. That's not counting like the heat and the humidity and anything else. But so that was my breaking point. And that was where I was like, okay, I can't do this. So honey producing colonies for me, when you hear me say 46 colonies, that's not counting removal hives. That is just my normal managed colonies that I use to produce my honey. Now you turn around and you look at the fact that some of those are top bars, some of those are Langstroths. So you're going to have different honey productions. Some of them are in 2-foot hives. Some of them are in 4-foot hives, so there's different capabilities, and depending on how you're managing them and how quickly, how frequently you're out there doing the stuff, can drastically change what you get. Then you've got the flow that happens. So the very first thing that I was ever approached with was a local restaurant to Austin that was like, we want to sell your honey and we want to buy like a gallon a week. And my heart stopped, because I was like, do you know how much honey that is?
That's a lot of honey.
It's a lot of honey.
The other thing I would say is working those colonies and managing them for honey production is a lot more work than managing them for just staying alive and just doing their thing.
There's a lot of timing that goes into it. You've got to be very, very conscientious of their flow and their calendar, not necessarily
you don't want them
yours.
To swarm, you want them to produce. There's a whole lot of management that goes in that's not as complicated. When you're doing it, you're using the bees as services. You're placing them, you're renting them out, you're potentially selling bees. Well, selling bees is also a lot of management, but if you're just doing services and you're not trying to get honey production, it's not as much work. The other thing that's a lot of work is the harvesting process. And if that's not enough, there's also the extraction process, and then add to that the bottling and the labeling and the promoting and the taking it to the market, all
done by hand by one individual.
Yes,
it eats up your entire life. That's also why I said, if you add in every time you drive out to the apiary to check on that colony, the mileage and the fuel, just that alone makes the honey unaffordable for everybody.
That's
You know,
exactly
like
right.
if you add that in there, and then when you turn around and you take into the consideration of the fact that like I am creating the labels, I'm designing
Mhm,
them, I am then
mhm.
printing them, I am then physically putting them on every single
Right.
jar, I'm filling the jars, cleaning the jars, sanitizing the jars, like all of the stuff, and then packaging it and shipping it and delivering it, and you know, yada yada yada. But so because of that, there have been times that when I went ahead and made that deal with the restaurant, I then had to
Mhm.
guarantee that I was going to have that honey available, which means when I do my
There's
extraction,
pressure. Yeah.
I already have to have calculated up the math to be able to provide at least 2 gallons a month to this restaurant for 12 months. So all that has to go into storage. That all goes into a deep freeze
Mhm.
and that stays there. And I cannot touch it because they are going to
That's
need their
theirs.
honey. Then whatever's left over is for me to turn around and bottle into the individual jars and sell it, which I make a shitload way more money
Of
doing the
course.
individual jar than selling them a gallon of honey at wholesale. So the next time somebody came up and said, "We want to carry your honey," I was like,
No,
"No." It was an adamant
not.
no.
So I have said many times over, honey production, the way when it's done right, it's absolutely not worth the work for the income you get out of it.
Right.
It's not worth our time. It's
No,
not worth
it is a
our
lot of
effort.
time invested for very little return.
That's right. So if you're in that position, at the very least, if you're going to sell honey, I would say go for the high end boutique prices, retail, just kind of don't
Mark it
even
up.
sell it yourself. Don't go through commission based retail. Just max out the price to what you feel is comfortable. And I'll be honest with you, if you educate your customers and your marketing is right on spot on, you're still going to sell out of that honey anyway. So
Absolutely.
it's precious and it should be sold as something precious because what you have is rare. Everything else out there has been adulterated or is not the person's honey, and the only reason that it's worth it for them to do that is because they've got the volume that they can afford to have by buying bulk and reselling
That's
retail.
right. That is absolutely correct. And even if you are worried about, oh, but if I put $20 on this, like nobody's going to buy it. It's all about educating the consumer. Once they try it, give a free sample. And once they try it,
Mhm,
they're going to be like, oh my God. And then they know you, they know the story of the bees, they know where it
mhm,
came from, they know that it is the most unique thing they've ever tasted, and they don't
mhm,
mind buying it. And then they come back. And that's how,
mhm.
like, for me, I have waiting lists. I have more waiting lists for people that want the honey at specific times of the year than I did for
That's
people
right.
that wanted bees.
Right.
And that's when then you have this guaranteed built-in residual income, but it's
Mhm,
still seasonal. It
mhm,
is still well, when you and I did the discussion on the business of bees, we talked
mhm.
about how you need to have something for every part of the season if it's going
That's
to be
right.
your whole livelihood, because the honey is only going to take up a certain portion. You have
Yeah.
to have other things to fill in there. But the selling of the honey, that's why it is seasonal. If you're truly producing it on your own, you're not reselling it, you're going to run out.
And then there's something else, being be mindful. I would say if you're in it for the honey cells, you're going to manage your bees and you're going to exploit them and push them a lot harder than if you're not in there for the honey. And then you make your money in different ways, meaning teaching classes, doing apprenticeships, doing services, consultations, all this stuff, selling bees potentially, although that also pushes you to push your bees a little bit more.
Yep.
But be mindful of that. If you're wanting to do right by the bees, know that any kind of honey production is really going to tend to put more pressure on your colonies if that's the only source of income you're relying on.
That's true. That is absolutely correct.
Mhm,
And raising and selling bees,
mhm.
possibly more of a pain in the ass
I
than honey
know,
production.
because then you lose bees sometimes, right?
You lose
It's
bees, you're guaranteed, like, so I know that's not the point of this discussion, but I
mhm.
mean, it is one of those where, yeah, if a colony fails and it was a nuke, you've already promised that to somebody. You've got to make that up by doing another split or getting another thing.
Exactly.
You're at
Or
the
you
whim
sell
of
that
Mother
nuke.
Nature.
Yeah, or you sell that nuke and it dies in their hands.
Right. Well, see,
And
so my caveat to that has been that from day one, I have always
mhm,
delivered, installed, and gave a consultation with every nuke I ever sold so that I knew for a fact
fact
I
that they
was
were
there, I put those bees in, you were there watching me. I showed you the queen. I identified the food source. I identified all the aspects of it.
That's
We
right.
put it in there. And when I left your property, them suckers were in great condition. What you
And
did
then
after I
that
left
is not,
is not my problem.
But it's still, and I know I digress. It still depends also on the quality of bees you're raising. Some people will still say you sold me bad bees.
Right. Yeah. And well, I mean, and that is actually something. So most of the bee sales that I did, I had repeat customers and they bought bees several years in a row. And it wasn't to replace bees that they bought the year before that died. It was to continue growing their apiary. And that's a big thing right there too, because there are other, we did youth scholarship programs, and we bought bees in packages from large producers, and they all died.
Because they're commercial.
They're commercial bees. They've been
Treated
treated.
bees.
They don't know how to survive in the wild on their own. And that was with a mentor and a parent and a student, all three managing and taking care of colonies, and they still died. So yeah, that's that's a whole other thing.
If you're trying to make money with bees, you can't rely just on honey. You can't rely on just selling bees.
Nope. You got to diversify.
Services as your key. Yeah, you have to not put all your eggs in one basket. But also what I would say is that go niche.
Yep.
Because you're not going to be able to compete on price. You're not going to be able to compete on volume with anyone. There's too many commercial beekeepers, people that packers, honey packer producers, too many people that are already established. If you're smart, go for the niche and boutique kind of strategies. Find your own way.
Especially if you're in a place like where we are at this exact moment today, like in Austin, where you could throw a rock and hit somebody that has something to do with bees. And if you're in that type of market that is so super saturated, how do you stand out? How do you distinguish yourself and make yourself make a name for yourself? You got to do something different. You got to be unique. You know, there's got to be something to it.
Doing.
Yeah. Best of luck.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually working out really well. So
I meant to our listeners.
Oh yeah. Thanks. I took it for myself because I can still use all the luck I can get.
Yeah. No, yeah, but so we digress there just a little bit at the end.
Yeah,
but
we did.
Ultimately, just keep in mind that whatever you do reflects on you. So the morals and ethics that you use in your beekeeping practices and in your honey cells reflect directly to you. And it can either be your biggest selling point or potentially be your biggest fault and downfall in the end. And hopefully you are on the right side of that. And you are an individual who stands up for what you believe in and actually goes through and practices what you preach.
And I would say, if you're on the wrong side of things, just know that, you know, John and I and Les are educating people around us. That's true. We will tell people what's going on in the world of beekeeping.
That's true too. There's so funny little side story here for just a last little tangent, and then we will sign off. But as everybody knows, like, I love to tell stories because I encounter so many different people and I'm in so many different weird and random situations. Most of them are removal related. A good portion of them, though, are training and consultation type things. And there has been numerous occasions where I have went somewhere and somebody listens to the podcast and the first thing they say to me is, please don't retell this on the podcast. And if you do, please don't use my name, know? And I laugh because I'm like, well, usually those stories, they're either stories where the other person understands and it's all fun and games and like we're learning and we're moving forward. But there's also the stories where I'm like, you are freaking on crack. And those are not necessarily people that are current clients or anything else. And they're not anybody that necessarily listens to the show. That's right. But it is still reality. And there is still a lesson there to be learned for people where you show up in a situation and you're like, why on earth would you ever do that?
We should do a show just on that. The outlandish things that people will do with their bees.
Yeah, we totally could. I've got years worth of stories.
We have several examples we can come up, and those are very often very funny in the end.
They ultimately are. And to those listeners that, you know, I have been out there and done consultations and things like that for you guys. You know, a lot of the times, like David, for instance, I've told many, many, many stories on David, and David's not even here in the state of Texas. I've never met the man in person at all, but we have lots of conversations and communications via social media and email. And I've went through and helped him troubleshoot some of his hives. And those stories are learning examples where I can give an example of like, so this is what occurred. This is what he witnessed and experienced. This is how I take it. And this is the advice that I would give. And that's all for the point of everybody being able to, like Les says, we all rise together. So we're trying to learn from each other's mistakes and maybe not make those same mistakes if you have that advanced knowledge. It's like foresight and foreshadowing. You know, if you know what not to do, then you can try to avoid those pitfalls. That was the whole point of the podcast for season 1 and 2. Learn from these mistakes that everybody's going to make when you first start, and maybe you can avoid the pitfalls. Or worst case scenario, you can say, well, at least I'm not alone. I'm not the only person that did that, so I don't feel so bad now.
And that's not, I don't want people to feel like they cannot tell their stories or explain what's going on or ask their questions either. Right.
Absolutely not. And most of the time, if I do tell a story that is like, if I use somebody's name, it's not a bad story. It's a learning example maybe, or it might be something fun and entertaining, but it's not a bad story. It's when I purposefully leave people's names out. That's the stories when I'm like, okay, we can still learn from this, but this was dumb.
like vacuum bees at the entrance of a hive or whatever. You've seen that before?
No.
Oh, because
I know for a fact the lady who actually, okay, so you brought up something directly. There is an individual that we know in common who does removals, who advised a lady that's how she needed to take care of a top bar hive that was overly aggressive. But the top bar hive was overly aggressive because she never managed it properly. And she constantly was getting stung, and she would piss them off to the point that they would sting the neighbors. And then she blamed it on the bees. And I had actually physically been out there to that hive, managed it multiple times, and never once had the bees even attempt to sting me, let alone go anywhere else. It was when she did it herself and nobody was around that every time everything went to crap. So the common denominator was the beekeeper, not the bees.
The steps that she had followed to manage that hives were incredibly mind-boggling and not adapted to the bees. But what got me is that she ended up, because she thought the guard bees were the problem, she ended up sitting in front of the hive and vacuuming all the bees coming out because they were supposedly guard bees and the defensive one.
But somebody told her to do that.
I want to know offline who told her to do that.
You already know it's somebody. You're gonna be dumbfounded. Somebody told her to do that, and the kicker is the neighbor. So she suckered her neighbor into actually doing bees as well. The neighbor was trying to actually be a better beekeeper than the person that started this whole thing. And I would still go out and manage and help and do training and stuff with the neighbor. So I kept getting these updates when the other person would no longer speak to me because I kept saying, no, like,
you can't do it.
I have told you this many times, that is not the proper way to do this. You're going to have to learn this on your own, because at this point, I just can't anymore with you. And so the neighbor would call me and be like, you're never going to believe what is currently going on. The fire department is out here. The police department is out here. All these things are going on because of XYZ. And I'm just like face palm, the whole time, like, oh my God. But I can see the escalation of how it got there. And then ultimately it wound up with that story that you're talking about, where they got sucked up in a vacuum to get rid of the guard bees that were the problem. And for 3 years, that hive was never a problem. It was only when one individual would manage them incorrectly and for way too long that they would get very irritated.
Yeah, people, educate yourselves. That's what you're doing when you're listening to the podcast, so that you're very much aware of how the bee colony works and what to do when you need to do it.
Yes. Be mindful.
Be mindful.
Have some freaking common sense.
That's right. Let's just say it out loud.
So here's a funny little thing. I have already said this like 2 times. Like, I swear we're gonna get off here. The bank that I used to work for back in the day, before I went full-time beekeeping and all that, their motto and logo is "Where Common Sense Lives." And I still, to this very day, swear to God, common sense has never set foot through those doors.
That
ever.
building. No,
So,
yeah.
unfortunately, that is something that you encounter a lot when you start dealing with the general public and the uneducated in any specific genre of anything. There's a lot of lack of common sense.
And I have said so, because beekeepers can be rough and gruff and, sometimes just kind of, not very patient with people that either are new or inexperienced or just are lacking common sense. And I'm like, at the very least, if you have nothing nice to say, just kind of don't say anything.
Right.
Otherwise, kindly and patiently keep on explaining the same things 20,000 times over, because that's what's needed. And if you don't, then you give all of us a bad name.
Right. Yep. That's that exact first part of that is the reason why one of the panel discussions was cut from the upcoming conference, because when we reviewed it, I was like, you realize this is going to be a bunch of old curmudgeons sitting around complaining and griping, right?
Yep.
And they were like, and I was like, could there be a better use of our time?
Yes, and a better image of the beekeeping world.
Yeah. So that one had to go away. It was replaced with an actual training course as opposed to a discussion course on the same topic matter, but it will draw a different audience that actually needs that education versus somebody sitting in a room listening to a bunch of people complain.
Well, and probably better education material in a way,
Yes.
Because what happens when you have old beekeepers that are very experienced, they all know their thing and they're just kind of bantering with each other. It doesn't necessarily make any sense to the audience either.
Nope. Yeah, exactly. So, all right. Well, there you go, everybody. On that note, I hope you learned something today.
I think we should make this one public, because I think everybody needs to know about the dirty secrets of honey.
They do. They definitely do. And maybe someday down the road, we will release this to the general audience. But for right now, this one comes out on the Patreon exclusive feed.
That's right. Just for you guys, lucky people.
Yes, because if not, there won't be anything to come out on the Patreon exclusive feed, because this week has just gone to hell in a handbasket.
maybe in 5 years we'll release it.
Yeah, 1, 3, 5, whatever, something. It'll get out there. We can also do a kind of a rehash or another iteration of this at some point as well, where we go through and do that. So, but anyhow, thank you all for tuning in for a very spirited conversation about ethical treatments of honey and also your bees. Yeah, definitely so. Hope you all enjoyed. Hopefully you got some education in there, or at least some laughter here and there, and some things, some food for thought on your adulterated honey. And we will be back with you next week for more of these Beekeeper Chats. So stay tuned, and until then, be good.
Be mindful.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This Hive Jive production was made possible by amazing patrons like you, and we appreciate your support. To all our Hive Jive junkies out there, you truly are the bee's knees.